Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Molly Gray. I'm so pleased to serve as Vermont's 82nd Lieutenant Governor, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome everyone to our inaugural Seat at the Table event. I'm pleased today to introduce Jay Nichols, who is the Executive Director of the Vermont Principals Association, Betsy Bishop, the President of the Vermont Chamber of Commerce, Jessa Barnard of the Vermont Medical Society and who serves as the Executive Director, Philene from AARP-Vermont, who serves as the Director, and Zach Tomanelli from the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, where he serves as the Communications and Technology Director. These Seat at the Table events are aimed at elevating the voices of Vermonters in Montpelier. Each week, or every other week rather, we'll host a different event on a topical issue facing our communities around the state. As we all know, broadband has been an incredibly challenging issue for Vermont. It's not a new issue by any means, but what is new is how a lack of access has impacted our communities in new ways, from telehealth to remote learning to online learning rather, and remote work, to economic opportunity and public safety. Broadband has been the pathway, or the highway rather, for a lot of basic human needs across the state. So today is about elevating those needs, elevating the voices of communities impacted across Vermont. So without further ado, what we'll do today is we're going to ask each of our speakers two different sets of questions. Questions that relate to the need and also how we address the need. Then finally, we'll open up today's event to all of you. As the series goes on and as our speakers talk today, please feel welcome to put your questions into the chat, and then we'll get to them during the question and answer period around 1:15. I'd also like to note that today's event is being recorded. So without further ado, I'd like to begin with Jay Nichols, who again serves as the Executive Director of the Vermont Principals Association. Jay, if you could begin by telling us how this pandemic has increased necessity for remote learning and impacted the learning gap between students, that would be great.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. So I'd say to start off, the lack of high quality broadband connectivity is a major problem for many of our students. This is especially true for our most vulnerable and most economically fragile families. Many rural spots in the state have limited access to no access at all for families. In fact, the pandemic actually served to widen the learning gap between the haves and the have-nots just based on where someone lives and whether or not they can have access. When we think about public education and the benefits of public education, one of the most important is that all students have an equal opportunity to be successful. And unfortunately, in today's world, for students to be successful, they need to have access to high quality broadband. As schools turn more and more into the uses of technology to augment and innovate instructionally, we need to make sure that all students have access to high quality internet at their homes. And that's not just during a pandemic, that's during normal times, whatever the new normal is going to look like. We need to get to a place where all students have that access. It needs to be a fundamental human rights issue for our students. And I'll just start there, Lieutenant Governor.
Thank you, Jay. And I should also mention that you and principals around the state have obviously been on the front lines, and we just greatly appreciate all of your incredible work at a time where there has been no roadmap for all that we're experiencing. But I want to next turn to Betsy Bishop and bring in another piece of this conversation. And that's the conversation that really relates to our small businesses across Vermont. Betsy, much of Vermont's professional workforce is working from home. We've all know that, we're here today on Zoom and needing strong broadband to communicate and to engage in economic opportunity. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that's working?
Sure. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Gray, for having us today. It's a really important topic, and I think the panelists will get at different pieces of this. And the piece that I'll talk about is the professional workforce. So it's not the entire workforce, but those that are able to work from home. And I will tell you that over the last couple of months, I have had the privilege of speaking to hundreds of decision makers in businesses. Sometimes that's a business owner, sometimes it's a CEO, but for mostly in Vermont, that's a small business owner. And the one word that they have used throughout, no matter the state, whoever I've talked to, is the word seamless when I ask them, how has that transition gone? Which is not the story we often hear, right? So meaning that their workers were able to transition to a remote working environment seamlessly. That puzzled me because so much of our discussion is about not having enough capacity, not having enough broadband. And so when you dig a little bit deeper, they do say, well, yes, we do have some segment of our people who work from home who were not able to connect. And how that is working is that they're usually doing that on a case-by-case basis with workarounds, sometimes granting them permission to work at the office. And when you dig a little bit further, you find out that this is in areas where there are folks who cannot remote work because they live remotely. They live in rural Vermont. And so when we look at that, we really think about how is that going to be able to change the workforce of the future? Are you, as employers are looking at what post-pandemic world looks like, they're talking about bringing back their workers, but the majority of them are talking about a hybrid model. But one of the benchmarks that in order to be granted to work hybrid remote or fully remote, you're going to have to prove to your employer that you have a decent broadband connection. The good news is that the majority of the professional workforce doesn't need the highest capacity broadband available, often the most costly broadband, but they do need to be able to stream, Zoom, tap into their VPNs, basically what we're doing today. So it's important to make sure that our entire state is covered so people are not now looking at a new normal where they're restricted to job access based on where they live or what their broadband connection is. Because I do think post-pandemic, we are going to get to a point where employers are looking at where the headquarters is, where their business is, and whether or not they need as much of that or whether the workforce wants to work remotely. So it's an exciting time for workers and employers. Employers are finding that their workers are much more productive, actually. Productivity has really increased, which you wouldn't think would be the case, but that's because of the access that folks have to working remotely.
Thank you, Betsy. I think what we're starting to hear already is that there's new pieces of our landscape, the new normal, right? The new normal around online learning that may stay, some pieces may stay, the new normal around hybrid work and what that may look like for jobs and businesses in the future. I think another piece of the broadband discussion that's come up and been exposed over the last year is how health has been impacted, or access to healthcare rather. So I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Jessa Barnard of the Vermont Medical Society, to talk a little bit about what we've learned and what's been exposed by this pandemic in terms of access to telehealth or telemedicine. Jessa, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for hosting this event and bringing up this topic in such a group with depth of understanding and interest in it. So I represent physicians across the state, and it's interesting that the needs are not different, and that we've known for years around Vermont that transportation to medical appointments is an issue, weather can be an issue, mobility. There are many issues that have made it hard for individuals at times to get to the doctor's office, but it's been a challenge to address that. And in one way, just like the pandemic's forced overnight change in so many areas, it has in healthcare as well. And I'm sure many of you on the line today have had a remote doctor's appointment over the past 10 months. And so I think we really have opportunity here to help get access to Vermonters if they have the broadband to do so. In fact, one of the issues our members feel really passionately about addressing in the next couple months during this legislative session is access to audio-only medical services, because we know that a lot of Vermonters either don't have the broadband, don't have the technological equipment or skills to connect, or that they'll try to do a video appointment and then it'll get dropped and they'll have to revert to a phone appointment. And while phone can't do everything, at least it can do some of the triaging, the screening to see if somebody really needs to come in person to a visit. So while we would love to see everybody have broadband and have the option of video, that's sort of the gold standard of remote medical appointments. Phone is kind of a critical lifeline at the moment too, to get those services. And interestingly, what our members have said is that the no-show rate has gone to almost zero with phone and video medical appointments. In some practices, it could have been up to 25% on a given day of people who, had a work conflict, their car wouldn't start, their child care fell through, so they couldn't, bring their children with them. So it's actually really helped. It's helped increase capacity for appointments. It's helped increase access to especially mental health services. There's been stigma. People might not want to be seen in the parking lot of a therapist's office or a psychiatrist's office. So in some ways, this is really, we're learning from this and hope to take a lot of this forward. I don't think you'll see telehealth services be used quite as widely as they were early in the pandemic, when basically that was the only option. We know a lot of patients do want to come in and see their doctor for the most appointments, but it will probably, we estimate, remain maybe around 15-20% of medical appointments could transition permanently to being telehealth visits.
Did you say 15 to 20%?
Yeah, and that's, maybe I'll broaden that. Maybe 10 to 20% may remain that way, and it depends on specialty. It depends on obviously patient interest. It's not something that we want to force on patients for sure. We want it to be their choice. Is it more convenient for them? Do they feel like they can relate to their practitioner that way? So obviously, some patients love it and want to keep doing this forever. Some would rather have that face-to-face relationship, but it will remain. Certainly a tool in the toolbox to providing care to patients.
It's hard to put a finger on silver linings in this pandemic, but I think in some ways, access to telehealth, or the potential for access to telehealth, is one of them. I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Philene Taormina from AARP-Vermont, to talk about sort of another unique piece of this broadband question that we're all grappling with, and sort of the new needs that have been exposed across various communities in the state. So I think the question for you and for AARP is, why is availability of high-speed internet important now more than ever to secure older adults with the resources, to make sure they have the resources to age comfortably and independently? Vermont being one of the oldest, I think, or maybe now the oldest state in the country, this is a particular poignant question. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'd love for you to reflect on that topic, Philene.
Thank you very much for inviting us to the table, Lieutenant Governor Gray. I apologize for my technical difficulties getting on the call. I'm sure everybody's used to that. For AARP members, more now than ever as a result of the pandemic, access to broadband, high-speed internet allows older Vermonters to age in place safely and engage in telehealth, as Jessa just pointed out. But there's also civic engagement, connections to friends and family, entertainment, educational opportunities, and all kinds of vital programs that people access online now. So they completely are shut out if they don't have access to high-speed internet to a whole world that's now even more open than it was before. I think one of the things with the pandemic is we're all in the same boat, but there were people on that boat already, and they don't have access to high-speed internet. They don't have access to the services that they need. A big issue for older Vermonters is isolation that has been made much, much worse during the pandemic. They can't see family, they can't see friends. So isolation is very bad for people. It's specifically bad for older people. It can lead to onset early dementia, mental health issues. So that's a big issue. The other issue is affordability. Vermont has some of the highest financial insecurity for older Vermonters, and achieving digital equity requires that Vermont address the affordability barrier along with infrastructure build-out barriers. As income declines, so does high-speed internet access. So that's a big issue. AARP believes that now more than ever we see that high-speed internet is a public utility and needs to be treated like one, just like electric or water. The difference is that with electric and water, you turn on a light switch, you turn on the faucet. With broadband or high-speed internet, just because it gets to your door doesn't mean you know how to use it. And there's a lot more there with digital literacy that we need to do as an organization, but really all of us need to do to make sure that people who lack proficiency in English, people who are differently abled, people who have, medical challenges can basically, engage in internet services at what I would call digital equity, really. So those are the main things AARP has been, really noticing. It's also, as the vaccines roll out, a lot of it's been online so far. I think the state is shifting, but there's a real expectations that people who have access to the internet know how to use it in every way. And older Vermonters definitely need more help with that. People who were born 50 today and could be an AARP member have 20 years more digital experience than someone born 20 years ago. So, and that will continue to improve.
Thank you. I think you really hit the nail on the head in talking about access, and access not just being, as you said, is their internet accessible to the home or from the home for all the various ways that's possible, but what does it look like? Do you have a computer? Do you know how to use a computer? Here we are all on Zoom. I think a year ago, we would have been like, Zoom, what? What is that? How do we use it? So thank you for that important perspective. I think it's also a really good segue to our next speaker, Zach from VPIRG, who serves there as a communications and technology director. Zach, could you talk to us a little bit about VPIRG's perspective on what impact the lack of broadband access has had on civic engagement in Vermont and just the ability to access government, be it our town meetings or even the legislature? And we're here today with nearly 50 people Zooming in, which is pretty remarkable. But there's sort of this new question, what is digital democracy? What is civic engagement? What does that look like?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and thank you for bringing this together and for having VPIRG, Lieutenant Governor. So VPIRG, we have been and continue to advocate for policies that bring universal, affordable, high-speed internet to the entire state. And the reason is quite simply because we believe it's in the public interest. It's in the public interest for all the reasons you've already heard: education, telehealth, our local economy. But I'm glad you mentioned civic engagement, because that is a critical reason. And that was true even before the pandemic. The internet had increasingly become the place where we get a lot of information about what's going on in our democracy, participate, share information, but the pandemic has obviously thrust that into stark relief. You mentioned the legislature. Since March, the legislature's been conducting all of their work remotely. And in many ways, this has actually improved access and transparency for Vermonters. Vermonters no longer need to travel to Montpelier and crowd into a teeny tiny committee room to hear about an important topic. All those hearings are streamed live on YouTube right now. But guess what? That additional transparency is only available to you if you have reliable internet access. So, that divide continues. And that's just as true, if not more true, for our local government, select board meetings, school board meetings, you mentioned. And there are towns in the state that are really struggling to conduct business remotely and provide citizens with, access to these hearings, and not even just, citizens, but in some cases, select board members themselves, actual elected officials. So reliable broadband, high-speed internet is so critical. And I'll just note, and this is a theme that's emerging in all these, I don't think that this is an issue for just the duration of the pandemic. Again, some of the transparency measures that we've seen that have come as a result of this are things that I don't think Vermonters are going to want to give up, nor should they have to give up. I think that additional access to the legislature is a great thing, and we'll need to have discussions on how we can continue that when things get back to normal. But regardless, that also needs to be coupled with expanding broadband access and tearing down that divide. Otherwise, you're still going to have people who have access to the legislative process or have access to our democracy and don't. And that could even get more starker as, more of this stuff comes online and becomes done in a more remote setting.
Yeah, I think the inequity across, we've already heard even just in the last 20 minutes about the inequity across different platforms and civic engagement and ability to access government being top among them. I do want to, before coming back and ask a couple follow-up questions and then going to questions, just recognize the senators and legislators we have on the call. So Senator Ingalls, Senator Terenzini, Senator Clarkson, Representative Brumstead, Representative Wood, Representative Williams, McCullough, Peterson, Burrows. And I'm sorry if I'm missing anyone. If there are any other legislators, please feel free to put your information into the chat. I also know that Clay Purvis from the Department of Public Service is here. And I think I also see Secretary Curley. So I want to come back to Jay and ask sort of a follow-up question from sort of the remote learning, online learning perspective. You know, at some point, children will go back to school. You probably can speak to when that will be, but I really want to talk to you about, like, what is the silver lining, if there is one, from this moment? You know, what have we learned about remote learning or online learning, or the way that children in the state access education, and what does the future look like? Where do we go from here?
Oh, that's just a little tiny question. No problem. So let me start by saying that in terms of students going back to school, the vast majority of our K-6 students are going back to school in person right now. Many of them 4 days a week, some 5 days a week. The bigger issue, the harder issue, is our high school students, because with this virus, what we found is that high school students, kids from 7th grade on up, are essentially like adults in terms of how much they spread the transmission when they're breathing, when they're talking. So we have a 6-foot separation rule in schools for the older kids. So it just becomes a situation of amount of space. So until we have everybody vaccinated, I don't see us having all the high school students back until everybody's vaccinated. So the hope would be that we'd be able to have them all back, the beginning of next school year. Some places might be able to do it earlier than that. Again, though, it'll depend a lot on is your staff vaccinated and those types of things. So there's no certain answer on that question about when all the kids will be back in person. However, it's really important that I point out here, we're comparatively much better off than most states. I was talking to an executive director in California a few days ago, and they were saying that some of their schools have not been open to in-person instruction since last March, not one single day. I was talking to a Vermont principal yesterday who's getting close to her 100th day of her little elementary school being open to in-person instruction this year, which is remarkable. So the way that our state has handled this whole crisis has really been helpful. In terms of the future, I think we all know, and we've all known for a while now, that digital had the opportunity to disrupt learning, to allow for innovation in a lot of positive ways, to allow students to invest in things that were interesting to them, not necessarily just the curriculum they might be able to find in their school. The opportunity to take classes online in a subject area that you're really interested in, that maybe your small elementary school or your small high school can't offer, gets expanded by having strong digital connectivity. I really think that for the future, and I think someone else has already talked about it, it needs to become more like electricity. It needs to be something that is just a guaranteed right that everybody has. In schools, it wasn't that long ago when public education said, you know what, some of these students don't have any books at home, and maybe they live too far away from the library. What can we do about that? And early childhood programs and schools and nonprofits started giving books to families. So families that couldn't afford books would have books in the home. And then we found out there were a lot of kids that maybe didn't get the meals they need or the nutrition that they needed. So society decided schools are going to start feeding children lunch, and then eventually it became breakfast. And I think this might just be the next step in that evolution, where society needs to decide, you know what, we are in the 21st century. If people are going to move to Vermont, if they're going to be able to work in Vermont, if they're going to be able to take advantage of all these opportunities that our state could have to offer, we need to make it so that everybody has broadband. It'll help our students, it'll help our workforce, it'll attract more people to the state. And Lieutenant Governor Gray, you are right. We probably are the oldest state. And the last census, Maine beat us out. I'm afraid, though, when this one comes out, we're going to be the oldest. Nothing wrong with being the oldest, but we need to attract some young working families here. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure we have great connectivity. And regardless of what your zip code is, you can have access to that broadband connectivity.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. And I think the statistics are important to bring up just to drive home your point a little bit more. I think one in 3 kids from Newberry, where I grew up, still can't get online. And there's also questions around, it's not just about can you get online, but can you access the hardware to be able to do that? I know that I think the Vermont Libraries Association is here as well. And we've talked a lot about, getting laptops to those centers of town where kids can still get online. But thank you again for joining us and for raising a lot of important questions and issues about the future of online learning and how we close the divide here in the state so every zip code has the same level of access. Betsy, I want to come back to you and move again to sort of the business needs and looking to the future. I mean, what are you hearing from businesses about the future of broadband? We talk a lot about remote work and how we're going to attract people to the state, but I think there's a very specific business development, economic development component.
Right. So I think Jay brought up a piece of this. So as a state that has an aging demographic, one of the things that we've worked toward over the last several years is to make sure that when we're thinking about the world of work, that we're thinking about flexibility, not just for millennials who want it, but also for an older population who might not want to work 40 hours a week, but we still need them in the workforce. So that's something we have been working on. And then along comes this disruption that Jay mentioned, as we all now have to work from home in a variety of different ways. And the technology challenge that presents to workers as well as employers. I think as we look toward the future, sort of understanding that broadband equity is something that we're going to need to understand. I think most employers are going to move back to a place of hybrid work. So there will never be, I shouldn't say never, but more employers will be thinking about, yes, you can work from home some of the time and work in the office the other times. When you think about what that means, we want to make sure that everybody has access to that reward, if you will. And I will tell you that in my research, some people find that to be a reward and other people don't. Back to everybody's got a different, I like working in the office or I like working from home. So it does depend on what people want. But I think if we can get this right, if we can get greater access for all Vermonters, then I think that we can really think about marketing Vermont as a place to come and live and work. We do that already. The Senate Economic Development Committee and the Senate particularly, along with the rest of the legislature, has really endorsed the notion of a remote worker way before the pandemic happened. This will only add to our great story that we have, and it will increase the talent pool and broaden that talent pool that employers have to choose from if we get this right. I think employers have always wanted to try to think about how they can become an employer of choice, and they do lots of things, chili cook-off Fridays and massage Sunday, and you get to have a day off to go volunteer for your favorite nonprofit. These are all things that employers are doing to attract and keep good workers. This issue of broadband has always been an issue, but now if I have the opportunity to work remotely, I'm going to make sure that my employer is an employer of choice in this way as well. So I think that is something we have to think about. And then one worry I have is as employers think about the future of work and the allowing more people to work from home because they want that and it's working out well. What happens to our small communities, our vital downtowns that we want to make sure are thriving, that often have been built up because you have a large employer or even several small employers there, and that will change too as part of this. So those are all issues that we'll have to address as a state going forward. But the Vermont Chamber is really eager to join this conversation, and thank you for having us.
Absolutely. And I saw someone from Alberg type in their information, and I'm not sure where everyone's from, but please feel free to share. And if you're online, I suspect you're either at home or you're at the library, you figured out some way to get there. But I think when it comes to thinking about attracting remote workers to Vermont, it matters, right? If you're not going to move to Newberry if there's no internet access. And we see that just in the last year with houses being sold and where we sort of see an uptick in our population. But I really think the one issue you brought up was equity. And actually, Jessa, wanted to come back to you to talk about health equity and access over the last year. And we've known that there are individuals in the state who have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And I was wondering if you could talk about sort of the intersection of access to healthcare and some of our most vulnerable groups or marginalized groups that have really been more impacted or more greatly impacted, and whether there's a piece of this conversation that also really has to do with equity, frankly.
Thank you for the question. I think it absolutely has to do with equity and who's getting served and who's getting left behind, you could say. There was some great testimony. I want to give a big thank you to Representative Brian Chena and the House Healthcare Committee. They had a hearing on audio-only telehealth services last week, and he invited 3 excellent witnesses, one of whom was a social worker for the immigrant refugee population in Burlington, and she spoke about the transportation barriers that many of her clients have faced, as I said, for years. You know, these are not new barriers, but they may not have a car. They may not have reliable access to a car. In Vermont, as we all know, public transportation is a big challenge. And so to try to piece together somebody to give you a ride or public transportation, especially when you're working multiple jobs or having children, has really been a barrier to healthcare services. And she spoke about how her clients have more access now, and they're able to keep weekly or biweekly appointments with her, and maybe they'll have one on video and one on phone, and they can juggle that more flexibly in between their work schedule or on different hours. And so she thought this was bringing a great service to her community. And then there were 2 other witnesses, one from the LGBTQ population, one from the BIPOC population, just telling their own stories of how they were able to connect with their caregivers during this pandemic because of telehealth services, and how they hope that continues. And I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, particularly in the area around mental health and substance use disorder treatment, where there may be stigma or frequent visits. You may want to see your provider weekly or every few weeks. And so to make that more flexible, more available in your home or in a private space where you feel more comfortable talking to your provider has been a really great way to help provide access. But if it's not available to everyone, also really exacerbates inequities. And so I think having that broadband available, having phone as a backup until we get to the point where everyone has broadband. Otherwise, I think we really risk leaving people behind. We know from the data during the pandemic that people who are lower income, older age, more rural tend to lack broadband access and lack the ability to connect to these video healthcare appointments. And so it has been an equity issue, and we do hope to see it continue to improve over time.
Just one brief follow-up question. You and I had talked a little bit or discussed sort of insurance, and we're in this weird world where we're now accessing telehealth, but insurance policies don't always explicitly say that they cover telehealth. I mean, is there a piece of the insurance conversation that also needs to be addressed as we think about the pieces of telehealth that will remain or hopefully remain for the future?
Yes, there is. And I will say Vermont's actually been a leader in this area in telehealth generally. So the Vermont legislature actually changed the statute a year or 2 ago, probably about a year ago now, to say that audio-visual telehealth appointments have to be covered the same way you would cover an in-person visit through 2026. So there is a sunset on that, but at least for a couple of years. And so if you have broadband and have the ability to a device and the ability to connect that way, you're a private insurance company, a Vermont private insurance company will cover that service. The gap is in the phone-only services. Those are required to be covered during the pandemic under emergency rules, but not beyond that. And so that's actually the exact issue that the House and Senate healthcare committees are discussing right now, and the Department of Financial Regulation is looking into. So yes, the insurance is a piece of it, and actually, frankly, Medicare has made a big advance during the pandemic, but right now most of those changes are also pandemic specific. So if we're talking about our older population who could particularly benefit from not having to travel in the winter, we really need to keep talking to our federal delegation, because that's really a Congress and CMS issue for Medicare. So Vermont can only fix the piece we have control over. So that's another piece of the puzzle as well.
And I know that our congressional delegation would love to be here today, but they're working hard in Washington. And I know Congressman Welch has been at the forefront of thinking about broadband with the Rural Broadband Caucus. I want to come back to Philene and AARP. And sort of segueing from the needs of some of our older Vermonters. But we talked a little bit earlier about accountability and transparency, accessing, I think, Philene, which you coined as digital democracy, which is kind of an interesting concept as we, Zoom in, the Senate starts, gaveling in via Zoom, and the House is doing the same, and committees are meeting that way. Philene, what do you think that means? What does that mean for the future of the state and your members?
Yes, thanks for asking that. We talk a lot about the 23% of Vermonters who don't have access, and certainly we should be focused on investment infrastructure at the grassroots community level, which is happening. But the majority of Vermonters do have access. And since the 2000s, older Vermonters are one of the fastest groups, older adults, of using the internet. And when they do use the internet, they use it every day. The majority use it every day. So a cataclysmic event happened. None of us could have ever predicted it. I don't think any of us that are professional lobbyists would have ever said, if we could convince the legislature to get everything online, that'd be great. But as a result of this cataclysmic event, everything went online as far as hearings, and the fact that you can watch them go back, that they're preserved, it's a pretty radical step in the positive of transparency and access. And for AARP, that's meant we can recruit volunteers to monitor the legislature who some might have hearing problems, so they were very intimidated to come to the State House. Some don't drive, for all the reasons that we've talked about. But the actual building itself in Montpelier is restrictive. There are hearings online right now where 70, 80 people are watching. You can't fit 70, 80 people in any committee room in Montpelier at any, and God, you couldn't fit all of them. If all the hearings were that large, the building would just be overloaded. So it's a radical step in transparency that AARP really thinks is valuable to our members, because it allows them to engage in the legislative process and other government processes. And transparency creates trust. And we're in a time in, maybe less so in Vermont, but still true, where there is a trust and truth gap between government and citizens. And in order to create that trust, people need to get involved in government. And this is one way that they really can. And it also creates a more, I think the legislature has pointed this out as one of the things that it's a benefit, a more knowledgeable base of people contributing, because you can read the testimony. Like I said, you can go back. So you can really educate yourself. So the conversations I'm having with volunteers who are monitoring the legislature are really important, and really prove to AARP that digital access helps people not just criticize and comment on what's going on, but it encourages civic participation towards solutions. And I think that's the kind of digital democracy we want, right? We can reach so many more people. So let's engage them in the process so that they understand what government is, so they feel like they're part of it, so that they are part of it, and that we can build that trust and move forward with that.
Amen. I love it. I think that makes a lot of sense, and so much of what this gathering of today is about is leaning into government, bringing the voices of everyone in our communities into the State House. And I think to just add a little more commentary to what you said, Philene, last week, I think it was the NEK Collaborative hosted NEK Day, and there were over 100 people on a Zoom call. And just earlier in the week, there was the Mental Health Advocacy Day, and I believe there were over 200 people. So I hope that we can continue some of this. And I think that your point on trust and building trust and allowing for more access to government participation is extremely poignant and timely, now more than ever. I also want to remind everyone, if you have a question for our speakers, please post it in the chat. I'm going to go to VPIRG and back to Zach with one sort of concluding thought on sort of where do we go from here, but please feel free to share a thought, share a question. We've got a lot of expertise here. So Zach, back to you with a second sort of follow-up question. VPIRG has really been at the heart of working across our state and communities across Vermont to increase access to government, to increase support for access to town meetings. What do you think we do? What is the solution? And I hesitate to raise that because you say solution, and then we're going to get into CUDs and incumbent providers and all the incredible work that the Senate and House committees are doing right now. But I think there's a question around, what is a piece of that puzzle as it relates to civic engagement that is kind of really at the heart of today's conversation. So over to you.
Thanks for that question. And I think you probably can't bring up the question of community involvement in these solutions and not discuss CUDs or communications union districts. So I am going to go down that path a little bit. And I think it's important for folks listening, if you want to understand how communities themselves can tackle the broadband issue, I think you need to start by understanding communications union districts, CUDs for short, which are an entity created by Vermont law that allows 2 or more towns to bond together to form a municipal entity that builds communications infrastructure together. And this has a lot of benefits. The main benefit being that it allows communities to kind of tackle this issue themselves. And they can work at a regional scale. That means you can kind of combine less dense areas with more dense areas and sort of achieve that scale. Municipal entities like CUDs can access the revenue bond market. And their overriding mission is to provide every single person in their territory access to high-speed, world-class broadband. So because of this, in my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinion, I think working on this, in state government right now, they are a tremendous tool to achieving that goal. So folks know, in 2018, there were only two CUDs operating in the state. And the Vermont legislature passed a law in 2019 that did a lot of things. I'm not going to get into all the details of what that did, but largely it signaled to communities in Vermont that this is an issue that we want to empower you to take on and deal with on your own. And we want to encourage you essentially to establish CUDs. So since that law has been passed, there's now 9 CUDs established in the state. Here's just the thing a point I want to make. CUDs existing by themselves are not going to magically bring broadband to their communities. These are volunteer-run organizations. There's a lot of challenges there. Access to startup capital, access to startup funding, access to expertise. So I think what Vermonters can do is figure out how to support these entities. And the legislature is looking at that right now. Anybody who's interested, I encourage folks to take a look at the work that the House Energy and Technology Committee is currently doing. They're working on a broadband bill that in many ways is the 2.0 of that law that passed in 2019 that looks to see how can we continue to support these entities. So do take a look at that legislation. And then on a local level, if you are in a CUD territory, reach out and see how you can be supportive and get involved. Because I think very much so, this is something that is going to be solved, hopefully, on the ground by Vermonters themselves. And I'm really encouraged by that. And VPIRG has been very supportive of that model, and we want to continue to be.
Thank you, Zach. I love that. Solved on the ground by Vermonters themselves, ourselves, by all of us. And I think that's part of the reason we wanted to bring everyone together today to really talk about galvanizing the experience we have in the state, but also understanding the impact across different groups across Vermont, so that as we think about a readiness plan and as we support the House and the Senate, the administration, and our congressional delegation, where we have a lot of good leadership that recognizes the needs of rural Vermont, right? The needs of rural Vermont are the needs of rural America. And I think there's a real opportunity to get this right. But I want to turn to a couple of questions that have come in. Jason Van Dreisch asks, what can we do to reduce the impact on local economies of expanded broadband access? Meaning, as it gets easier and easier to make everyday purchases online, how do we level the digital playing field for local businesses? Betsy, I think this is a great question for you, and I'm going to send it your way. And then if other panelists want to chime in, please feel welcome to do so.
Great. So first, a disclaimer, my dog is with us, and if you hear random noises, I'm sure you're all used to that now in the Zoom environment, sort of a benefit from working from home. So yeah, I saw that question. I think it's really important to think about. First of all, I think the legislature has done some really great work over the last several years trying to make sure that there's a balance in taxation and how online purchases are treated for taxation purposes. So that's sort of a big piece of it. But really, we're talking about access and innovation. And boy, if I'm sitting at home and really not going anywhere, isn't it just much easier to, click a button for an app that I've already downloaded and all of that, rather than thinking about my local store? I think there's been a lot of innovation in that space. And I think that those local businesses are trying to sort of do something new and reach out to you and have you think about them in that local space. I think it's fair to say that a lot of these small businesses, our downtown sort of Main Street type businesses, are figuring it out. So many restaurants did not have an online platform just for you to do curbside and takeout and collect your credit card. In the March, April, May timeframe, you saw that go from non-existent to everybody's got that. And that was innovation, and there was a lot of disruption there. And by now they've really turned themselves into being able to do that. We've seen that with retail too, where retail are holding online buying sessions either on Instagram or on Facebook, and that's working well. But it's not a substitute for really thinking about that local business first. So I think we've got a long way to go. I see there's going to be more and more disruption in that because, after all, anybody who's ordered online gets that notice from UPS or FedEx that says, due to the pandemic, we have longer times for delivery, which means more people are using it. And our local stores are thinking about, packaging it and you coming curbside and picking it up just like you do your dinner. So I think those are some things that we are focused on. And I do think that will be continued disruption because, like many other things in this pandemic, some of these changes are here to stay. And if you are accustomed to now ordering whatever it is online that you're ordering, you're going to continue doing that. And I think there needs to be a concerted effort to really think about buying local and thinking about local first, which is something we've supported for years, but it's going to become even more and more important for our communities.
Absolutely. And I think what we've learned even just about purchasing from restaurants, right? We're pulling out menus online, we're online ordering and then doing the pickup. And there's just so many pieces of this that have changed the way we engage with business. I did want to ask a question about need. And this is actually a question for all of our panelists. There's been great data statewide about access. I think it's something like 60,000 homes and residences, and maybe less now, don't have access, or around 1/4 or a little less geographically of the state can't get online. But we don't today really know, I think, what the access is like for those who don't have the hardware. And I'm just wondering if maybe we can do around the room, the virtual table with our panels. If you could speak just to what you know of access of your membership, either around the hardware or around the physical access to fiber or whatever the service or source is. I think that'd be good in terms of quantifying where we're at in terms of closing the digital divide. And so Jay, I'm going to start with you and we'll go right on down.
So if I had to take a guess at it, I would say on average, about 20% of our kids don't have access to high quality, reliable broadband connectivity at their homes. In some places that number is 2%, other places it's 50 or 60%.
Okay. Betsy, we're going to go to you. I know it's maybe hard to quantify with businesses, but
it is. A number I keep hearing from different folks that I talk to, different leaders, is 10 to 15%. And one of the interesting things about that, so that's people who don't have sort of good quality broadband access in their home, making remote working difficult. But the other piece here is that there was a dichotomy depending on your position in a company. So maybe the higher up you are in the company, the broader your workload is. Maybe you had a laptop already where you could have worked from anywhere, but perhaps the admin assistant didn't have a laptop because you don't expect your admin assistant to work from home. So those person had more of a stationary computer that wasn't portable. That has all changed. There's equity now in devices that has already happened in the workplace, because with a very short period of time, everybody was ordered home, and some people already had that ability and others didn't. And so that's an interesting piece, sort of the equity of the devices we've already come across that bridge, which I think is great. The problem is some people took those devices home and didn't have a quality broadband connection, which is another area that we need to address.
Thank you. And Jessa?
Sure. I can't give you a statewide number. I can tell you that we work together. The Vermont Program for Quality in Healthcare received some of the CRF, Federal Coronavirus Relief Funds, from the legislature to help distribute devices to healthcare entities or individuals who needed access to healthcare services. And I believe they've distributed about 1,500, but that was there is demand well beyond that. And fortunately, some of these are in locations where multiple people can use them. So giving them to home health agencies so they can meet with multiple patients during the day, or some kind of assisted living or group living setting so that a number of their people can participate in video visits that way. But we know there's definitely not just the broadband need, but the device need to access these services.
And Philene?
So I don't know the exact number of Vermonters who are age 50 plus who don't have access to a computer. I know a lot of my volunteers have a flip phone still.
Yeah.
So I would gather that it's quite large. But, that is something AARP supports, using COVID relief funds for, providing the not just the physical devices, but the digital literacy to use them. That's AARP's increasing our offerings to members to gain digital literacy. And with that comes education about what kinds of devices they can use more easily. I think a lot of younger family member caregivers are stepping up to the plate as well to make sure that their parents have access digitally and have the materials they need, the hardware they need to do that. But it's an issue. It's an affordability issue. I mean, as I said, internet use goes down, and high-speed, internet use goes down with income. And so it's really an income barrier as much as it is maybe a generational barrier.
And there's a question from Representative McCullough that says, or asks, what is the percentage who are financially challenged preventing connection? Jay, I may come back to you if you have an additional thought on this, or Jessa, or Philene, do you have any sense of the financial barrier? Again, this is just where there's a piece of the data that I don't suspect have quantified yet. We just don't know. Do you know?
I don't know. I know that there are a lot of people who have access to internet now who can't afford it. And that just seems like the barrier that's closest that we should be able to eliminate. We don't have to lay fiber. We don't have to organize communities. It literally is like any other utility. If it's not affordable, people aren't gonna access it. And and if they can afford it and they lose income during a pandemic like this and they get shut off, then it's just, again, like any other utility. And there's a public good for all of us to be connected to public utilities. It benefits all of us to have people connected, whether it's telephone, water, heat, or internet. So.
And I would just echo, I agree with that. And I would say for students, schools have worked hard to mitigate that by giving students devices that they can bring home on that end of it. And then in many cases, we've given out at the VPA, we've given out almost $250,000 in grants from partnerships with some of the philanthropic organizations around Vermont, just to help with that very issue, mostly with food and with internet connection. But that's not a long-term solution.
Okay.
Whereas if it becomes like a utility, then it becomes a long-term solution for everybody.
Thank you. Zach, any final thoughts on the questions around percentage of members or the affordability question?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I don't have exact data on percentage of VPIRG members. I mean, we have 50,000 members and supporters across the state in every town. So I would imagine our membership very much mirrors whatever the statewide numbers are. And I know that in the telecommunications recovery plan that the state just put together, they did try to quantify some of this in terms of the financial barrier to Vermonters and that sort of thing. So we have some data on there, but this is so important. And you know, I just want to echo what some of the other panelists have said. You know, we often talk about, when we talk about lack of access, we are often focused on the sort of geographic lack of access, which is critically important. Like literally, do you have the technology running outside your house to be able to access high-speed internet? But if you can't afford the monthly service, then it doesn't really matter to you if you're considered served because you have the technology running outside your window. So I do think that's important for the state to look into long-term solutions on this. You know, I will note I believe it was the December federal recovery legislation that was passed, there was some money set aside for some federal subsidies for folks with low incomes. But again, I think that is maybe like an 8-9 month solution. I don't know that they've released all the details on that yet. That's not a long-term solution. So yes, it's incredibly difficult during the pandemic right now, but this digital divide, this lack of access, it's not going to just go away, you know, 8 or 9 months from now. So this is something that I think, you know, the state needs to be, you know, keenly focused on and start thinking about what are possible long-term solutions there.
Thank you, Zach. I think you really drove home the urgency piece, right? It's not just about how do we get fiber to the home or access to the service, but how do we do that in a way that's affordable, right? If internet's the highway to healthcare, to economic opportunity, to civic engagement, to education, to remote work, and the list goes on, we really have an urgent moment now to address it. There are a number of other questions here in the chat. I just want to recognize the Vermont Libraries Association for their work, especially in making Wi-Fi accessible. And I'm actually just going to recognize Tom McMurdo, just for a brief moment, and then we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you. Oops, we just got to get you off mute here.
There we are.
There we go.
Yeah, thanks for the shout out. We are actually the Vermont Department of Libraries, not the Vermont Library Association. So two different entities. VLA represents library workers, et cetera. Vermont Department of Libraries is part of the Agency of Administration. So
we're happy to have both here today.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, we just worked with the Vermont Community Foundation to distribute a grant to 98 libraries, $1,500 per library, and they're going to spend that on lendable laptops, which helps with that digital divide piece. They can also spend it on improving their wireless service outside their library. One thing that we've done during the pandemic, thanks especially to my colleague Josh Muse, who's here, is we got libraries to turn on their wireless internet service outside the building 24/7. So some libraries were shutting it off at night or when they weren't there, or just it was irregular. Now it's on all the time. So people know that they can drive to their library and get service. Of course, the problem there is what kind of service are they getting? Because as we all know, most parts of Vermont do not have great internet service. So anyway, thank you for the recognition. And yes, we are working hard on this, doing our best.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining today. And this concludes our first or inaugural seat at the table event. And I just want to take a moment to thank our panelists today. I hope you'll join me in a virtual round of applause for them, for all of their incredible work, for also sharing the stories of their members, from stories of Vermonters across our state and from our communities. We will have another seat at the table gathering in 2 weeks' time. We'll be sharing that topic very shortly and announcing it. But if you'd like to reach out to the Vermont Principals Association, the Chamber of Commerce, VPIRG, AARP-Vermont, or also the Vermont Medical Association, I know that the panelists here today are happy to engage. I'm happy to engage. We're going to put together a memo from this event with just some thoughts and recommendations on how we galvanize the expertise we have in this virtual room today, and also how we think about a readiness plan that really brings all Vermonters together across impacted communities as we prepare ourselves for whatever federal money is to come or whatever state plan is going to be implemented so we can close the digital divide here in the state. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks. Stay in touch.
Thank you.